Welcome to another episode of our video series of the Philosophical History with Contemporary Critique.
Hello, it's great to be back, ready to jump in.
How you doing?
I'm doing well, thanks. This is a massive topic we've got today. It feels both ancient and incredibly current.
It really is. We're charting the journey of formal learning from, the very beginning in ancient Greece, right up to the systemic crises hitting universities today. It's incredible how the core mission has both endured and been completely transformed.
That's really the heart of it, isn't it? We're going to be looking at the foundational philosophical shifts that shaped, well, everything, how we get knowledge, how we make knowledge, and maybe whether those foundations are even holding up anymore.
Okay, so let's unpack this history for you.
Mm-hmm.
We have to start with Plato's Academy, not just because it's sort of the first, but its location. Its physical place in the world tells us so much.
It absolutely does. I mean, think about it. It's an olive grove outside the city walls of Athens on land that belonged to a figure named Academos. That geography is a deliberate choice. It's a statement.
Especially when you contrast it with his predecessor, Socrates.
Exactly. Socrates was in the agora, the marketplace, the noisy public center of the city. He was out there grabbing people, interrogating them about virtue and how to live.
And we all know where that led.
Precisely. It led directly to his execution.
Yeah.
So Plato learned a very hard lesson from that. By moving learning outside the city, the academy immediately signals something different. It's more secluded, maybe more elitist even.
It's a shift from that immediate, messy public philosophy to something more universal, more insulated.
And the whole structure of learning was different. It's nothing like our modern system of, semesters and degrees and graduation.
Right.
The emphasis was on this concept of dinlame, which literally just means listening. It wasn't about getting a certificate. It was about this continuous process of engagement and inquiry. You were there for the long haul, not just to check off some boxes on a transcript.
Almost like a lifelong conversation.
A lifelong conversation, that's a great way to put it, for a very dedicated group of followers.
And this change wasn't just about location, was it? The whole intellectual focus shifted. Socrates was all about ethics. How should we live? How should we govern? Plato. He blew the curriculum wide open.
He really did. Plato shifted the focus to what we would now call sort of the hard sciences, universal subjects, things like mathematics, geometry, dialectic, the study of nature. He wasn't just trying to create good citizens, he was aiming to create philosopher kings.
It implies a certain level of rigor. That's where that famous inscription comes from, right? The one supposedly over the door.
Let no one ignorant of geometry enter here. Whether it was literally there or not, it captures the spirit perfectly. Geometry wasn't just a subject, it was the training ground for the mind. It was the prerequisite for grasping abstract reality itself, Plato's forms.
So it wasn't just the theoretical.
Oh, not at all. This kind of structured learning was seen as incredibly powerful, politically powerful, pragmatically powerful. The goal was to produce a governing class that could see beyond the shadows of daily life.
It's amazing. We just don't think of math that way anymore, as having a civic duty attached to it. So what did that core curriculum look like?
It was pretty tight package, all designed to build that conceptual power. You had arithmetic, basic calculation, logistics, which was more like applied math, then plane geometry, solid geometry, and kinematics, the study of moving bodies, which they applied to astronomy.
And music was in there too, right?
And harmony, yes, music theory. Because for the Greeks, harmony was a mathematical relationship that you could hear. It was all part of the same cosmic order.
This whole structure, it's so rigorous. And it leads us to maybe the most critical distinction in all of ancient thought, the one that defines the purpose of all this knowledge, the split between episteme and technique.
Yes. This separation it's foundational to their entire worldview. Episteme is real, theoretical knowledge. It's science, but it's science done for the pure sake of knowing, of understanding the world.
And technique.
Technique is just technique, a craft, a skill. It's what an engineer or an artisan has. It's about doing or making.
So a philosopher studying planetary motion was trying to comprehend the divine order of the cosmos. He was not trying to invent a better catapult.
Exactly. The purpose of knowledge was to comprehend the world, not to change it. The ancient view was that the cosmos was this fixed, intelligible thing. Our job was to interpret it, to understand our place in it.
Which is why that later critique, philosophers have only interpreted the world, the point is to change it, is so fundamentally revolutionary.
It's a complete 180. It marks the total inversion of the ancient project. This idea that the world is a giant engineering problem for us to solve. That's a product of the Enlightenment, of the Industrial Revolution. For well over 1,000 years before that, the Academy's mission was contemplative, not manipulative.
Speaking of 1,000 years, the longevity of the Academy is it's mind-boggling. It survived for nearly a millennium.
A millennium of continuous thought. It finally closed its doors around 529 AD. The emperor shut it down, most likely because of the growing tension between classical pagan philosophy and the now dominant monotheistic religion of the empire. But that's not where the story ends.
This is where it gets really interesting. The knowledge didn't just die, it migrated.
And that migration is one of the most important events in intellectual history. The scholars fled, and they took their manuscripts with them, the works of Plato, and even more importantly, the works of Aristotle.
And where do they go?
The evidence is pretty strong that they found refuge in the Sasanian Empire. Specifically, they set up a new intellectual hub in a city called Haran in the 6th century. And there, the Greek tradition was kept alive. It was studied, translated, preserved.
So Haran is the missing link. It's the bridge from ancient Athens to the Islamic Golden Age.
It's the organic link. Absolutely. From Haran, that knowledge flowed into the booming Islamic world. The texts were translated first into Syriac and then into this incredible, robust translation movement into Arabic. This became the foundation for the House of Wisdom, the Beit al-Hikmah, in 8th century Baghdad.
It's an unbroken chain.
It is, an unbroken chain that kept philosophy alive until it was eventually reintroduced to Europe in the later Middle Ages.
But we need to be really clear for you, the listener. None of these places, not the Academy, not the House of Wisdom, were universities as we think of them.
That's a crucial distinction to make. The university as a formal degree-granting body is a medieval invention. It pops up in Europe, say, between the 10th and 15th centuries. It was international, it was ecclesiastical, and it was built around the 7 liberal arts, the trivium, and the quadrivium.
And the modern research university, the kind we have now that's supposed to produce new knowledge.
That's even newer. That's really a 19th, even 20th century idea. The state's subsidized engine of knowledge production is a very modern creature.
Okay, so that brings us to today. Because now that we have this lineage, we have to talk about the profound systemic crisis facing that very modern institution.
And it does feel like a kind of betrayal of that original spirit. I mean, think back to Plato's Academy. Aristotle, his own student, heavily criticized his core theory of forms openly.
Right.
The environment was about debate. The goal was to figure out which questions to research, not which answers to accept. The modern institution, well, it can sometimes feel far more dogmatic.
So what are the pressures that are undermining that mission today? Let's unpack these 4 pillars of the crisis.
Okay, the first one is the influence of the military-industrial complex. It sounds dramatic, but it's real. Universities need huge amounts of funding, and a lot of that money comes from government agencies or private corporations with very specific utilitarian goals.
So the research agenda gets skewed towards things that are profitable or have military applications rather than pure curiosity.
Exactly. Institutional autonomy gets compromised. The money flows to engineering, to computer science, to things with clear applications, and it starves the humanities or pure theoretical sciences. It warps the priorities.
And the second pillar is an internal problem, the administrative takeover.
Yeah, this is something academics everywhere complain about. Universities have become these massive bureaucracies. The administrative staff, the managers, the deans of this and that whole apparatus just grows and grows.
And they start to overwhelm the actual academics.
They do. And you get these rigid systems that are more concerned with metrics and marketing and fundraising than with the actual core mission of teaching and research.
Okay, and the third pillar feels the most tragic. The betrayal of youth.
It's a global social crisis, really. The basic deal that was offered to previous generations, you get an education, you get a good job, you can afford a home, you have security, that deal is broken.
And how is the university part of that betrayal?
Because it's still selling the promise, but it can't deliver. Students graduate with crushing debt into a precarious job market and an impossible housing market. The very institution that was supposed to be the engine of upward mobility is now, for many, a trap. It's contributing to their financial instability.
And the final pillar cuts right to the act of teaching itself. Toxic pedagogy.
This is the more insidious one. It's the way fear and shame are used as tools in the classroom. Instead of encouraging curiosity and the courage to be wrong, these methods, they break a student's spirit. They teach you to please the authority, to give the right answer, not to discover your own. It stifles the very brain activity you need for discovery.
Which leads us to this radical idea, the one from the ignorant schoolmaster, the concept that if a teacher explains something to a student that they can't figure out on their own, that act of explaining is actually a form of idiotization.
It sounds harsh, but it's about dependency. The teacher becomes the one who has the knowledge, and the student becomes the one who lacks it. And so the student is forever dependent on that external authority. It chains them to the master instead of setting them free.
So the real model, the successful model, is Socratic. It's that dialogue with the slave boy and the Meno.
It's the perfect demonstration of real pedagogy. The philosopher asks the boy a geometry problem, how to double the area of a square. The boy makes the obvious but wrong guess. And what does the philosopher do? He doesn't shame him. He doesn't mock him.
No, he just asks more questions. He guides the boy to see the flaw in his own thinking.
And that moment when the boy realizes, oh, I thought I knew, but I didn't know that I didn't know, that is the single most important moment in education. Confronting your own ignorance without fear is the only way to really start learning.
So the formula is, teaching is impossible, but learning is totally possible.
Exactly. As long as the student is guided to discover for themselves without having an authority impose the answer. And this leads to a pretty profound goal for any real mentor, whether you're a teacher, a parent, a therapist. Your job is to work towards your own redundancy.
To make yourself obsolete.
Your success is when the student or the child or the patient doesn't need you anymore, when they have achieved full independence.
But the modern institution fights against that, doesn't it? It has a financial incentive to keep people dependent. Come back for another degree, another certificate, donate as an alumnus.
That's the structural resistance to autonomy. And if we really want to foster learning, we have to make mistakes cheap, low stakes, because as soon as the stakes are high, fear kicks in. And fear shuts down the part of the brain that does creative problem solving.
Which brings us all the way back to the core mission of philosophy, interrogating assumptions and making conceptual separations. Why is that so critical in our public discourse right now?
Because we are living in an age of what you might call conceptual hijacking, where two distinct ideas are deliberately mashed together to make criticism impossible. If you can't, for example, separate criticism of a government's policies from hatred of an entire people, then you've paralyzed all critical thought on the subject.
It's a trap. It makes any kind of nuance seem like a betrayal.
It's a trap, and the philosopher's job is to pry those concepts apart again, to draw the distinctions that others want to blur. If we lose the ability to do that, we lose the ability to think. This is maybe more important today than it ever was in ancient Athens.
So if the best education is one where the learner can confront problems and even fail spectacularly in a safe space, then maybe the subject we need to study most isn't math or literature. Maybe it's ignorance itself.
I think that's exactly right, and that's the final thought for you to take away. We have to ask not just why people become ignorant, but why they so often prefer it. We have that saying, ignorance is bliss, and that bliss, that comfort, it's a powerful shield against that terrifying Socratic moment. The moment you realize you didn't know what you thought you knew, the powers that benefit from dependency and fear, they thrive when we choose that bliss over the difficult but liberating work of finding things out for ourselves.